Good morning, everybody. I'm going to welcome on stage the different panelists. So Sam Clifton from InMotion Ventures, Dean Donovan from Diamond Stream Partners, Raj Singh from JetBlue Technology Ventures, and Alice Ferrari coming from Founders Factory just nearby. So have a seat. All right, so this first keynote was actually, I really feel that the energy already rose up this morning, like after the breakfast, really starting to get a lot of questions raised on this specific topic that is actually leading the way, let's say, in Europe, a really good example. I feel that we all are a bit in a gold rush situation, I would say, like where we feel that there's something to be done within 5-10 years. We'll speak about time frame. There are some examples of companies who managed to raise some significant funding, like Volocopter is one of them in Europe, but we also have in mind Joby Aviation in the US, Lilium also in Europe, XTI and so forth, really managing to get some capital. And I guess the idea of this panel is really to see from the investor point of view if it does make sense, what would be the thinking behind that, what do companies, startup companies, have to do to be convincing in this market. So I'm really pleased to have this panel because it's pretty diverse. We have Alice Ferrari with a really hands-on startup mentoring or expertise. She's actually working 500 meters away from here and really closely with the EasyJet company. I think I'm just going to start with you and then I'll move on to the rest of the panel because you have this day-to-day activities with startups. So what are your views on the need and maybe the opportunity there from a startup point of view?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here at Revolution Aero. So I'll start with just saying, giving you a bit of background on what Founders Factory is, in case you haven't heard of us. We are a corporate-backed accelerator and incubator of startups, meaning that we build and invest in early-stage businesses. We are corporate-backed, meaning that we go out and look for innovation for our corporate investors. Each of our investors represents a sector that we operate in. We have 7 different sectors here in the UK, and we have opened a new office in South Africa as well. Some of our corporate investors that we have here are L'Oreal for beauty, M&S for retail, but more importantly, EasyJet for travel, which is the sector that I look after. And each year we go out and invest in sort of late-stage technology for EasyJet, and we build 2 concepts in-house together with EasyJet that are kind of strategic. And it works 2 ways. It's about understanding EasyJet's needs and how to help them innovate in the areas of focus, but it's also for us to sort of challenge them and tell them what they should be looking out for. And it's interesting because we have been looking at some areas around this. It's obviously not into EasyJet's day-to-day unmanned vehicles, but it is something that we have been looking out for, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about it later.
All right, that was just an introduction. Next in line, I would say, I have Sam Clifton from InMotion Ventures. So you come more with an automotive background, working with Jaguar and Land Rover. So I think it would be really interesting also to have your insights based on the automotive industry. I always think that the perceived ideas, which is totally wrong, but flying cars can be either seen as an extension of autonomous vehicle because it's easy to make them fly, which I don't necessarily agree, but there are some logics there, or as an extension of drones, and we'll speak later on with cargo drones, maybe it could being an intermediate step. But from the automotive point of view, could you tell us a bit more what would be, let's say, for instance, lessons learned from autonomous vehicles? It seems that there's a parallel there.
Yeah, for sure. I guess a quick introduction to InMotion Ventures. We're Jaguar Land Rover's venture capital fund, investing from C to Series B in transportation predominantly and a little bit of the travel sector as well. So I think the really interesting part of that is, full disclosure, we haven't invested in an urban air mobility company yet. But the interesting part of that is looking at the autonomous vehicle space where we have invested in a company called Voyage in the States. You know, drawing the parallels between those 2 industries, I think is quite interesting. You've got sort of a few very well-capitalized players that are going after this full stack approach, you know, from Waymo even developing the LiDAR sensor all the way through to the different components of the technology stack. And then you've got other people they're kind of pursuing a partnership approach. So they're using suppliers for different areas of the technology stack. And that's what Voyager are doing, the company that we invested in. So what we've seen as people are pursuing that latter approach is this sort of ecosystem of partners that has started to, I mean, it's such a nascent industry anyway, the autonomous vehicle industry. We're only just starting to see these partners appear, whether it's in sort of teleoperations, so sort of the remote control car idea, through to simulation as a service for your autonomous vehicle brain, through to, well, all elements of the technology stack, mapping, localization. So I think as we then look at urban air mobility, I think right now we're kind of at that space that maybe we were at sort of 5 to 10 years ago in autonomous vehicles, which is the well-capitalized players are kind of doing all the developments, and there's no real ecosystem starting to develop. And I think, over the next 5 years in urban air mobility, I could imagine that this ecosystem starts to develop, and you start to see people developing the different components of the technology stack, and that could be enabling, new companies to appear as more of a sort of integrators of different areas, taking on the likes of the well-capitalized, Volocopter, Lilium, or whoever it is. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time, and I think having not invested yet in this space, I'm really excited to see where opportunities for us as an earlier stage fund with, we're not able to write $100 million seed checks. We're writing sort of anywhere from 500K to £5 million. So, as that ecosystem develops, are there opportunities for us to invest at early stage, that's within our reach? But yeah, very excited.
Okay, good. I think there will be some questions about that, really. And it makes me think, actually, yes, in Gold Rush, actually, there's a saying that you should make shovels, and maybe that's what we are going to see. Yesterday, there was Nodine actually presenting on stage among other startups, but it raised the most interest in the Startup Challenge from a jury point of view, because actually it's an enabling block, a building block that could be translated. So, okay, interesting thought. Okay. Next, it's just the first introduction before after we all hell break loose, and you have so many questions coming from you. The idea is to really to bring the different perspectives here. Next in line, so I'm pleased to have Dean Donovan from Diamond Stream Partners. So you have you have made some investments in the aviation industry. You're also known for 2004 to have launched you told me about the low-cost Mexican airline, Volaris. But really recently you invested in Elroy Air. It drew my attention because it's a cargo drone, and also Starburst invested in a different one, but we believe in that. And also some Stellar Labs that I think could be interesting. So what are your views from that rationale, let's say, of investing in freight?
Yeah, so we've been investing for aviation for 15 years now. Commercial aviation as well as private aviation, business aviation, and now the drone space as well. Our primary investment thesis is to look for areas where there'll be market stimulation, and then understand what that market stimulation will create demand for in terms of infrastructure and services all the way up and down the value chain. So our view, and perhaps it's shaped by having started a low-cost carrier, is that the biggest markets in transportation are always cost-driven. There's niche markets, but most of the big success stories in aviation over the last 30 years have been cost-driven. And so that's really our thesis, and we can talk about that with respect to cargo, where I think you're going to see stimulation from reduction of cost and urgent cargo to all sorts of different elements of the value chain. All
right. And last, it's actually a good progression, because actually I feel like you're a superstar coming from California, actually with also this JetBlue Corporate Ventures that is really active at the cross-section, let's say, between travel and technology. I looked at your portfolio with travel software, let's say software-based travel companies, but also with two notable investments that I think will get a lot of reaction here with Joby Aviation and Zunum Aero. So can you tell a bit more about the investments? What was rationally, and what do you think will be next, basically?
Yeah. I mean, you can tell from my accent that I'm from California. Yes, JetBlue is a US low-cost carrier. It's about 5% of the US market. 45 million passengers a year, and 3 years ago they decided to set up this VC firm, which is really has the purpose of trying to source innovation that JetBlue could use in the future. The future being 18 months from now or 10 years from now. So it's not just about aviation, but we have 5 themes that we invest in around travel, transportation, and hospitality. And the 5th theme is around regional transportation. And so what we're thinking there is that there are 3 huge trends happening that will impact our business. And they've been discussed yesterday at this conference and many other conferences. The first one is urbanization. We've heard a lot of people talk about that. It's absolutely happening. For those of you who live in London, I believe the Northern Line got a bit of an update recently. It cost more than £4 billion, and it added how much extra capacity? None whatsoever. And the simple truth is that urbanization has presented a problem to us, which is you can spend all the money you like, but you're not going to solve the problem by improving the rail lines or even the bus lines. So how do you change that? Second big trend is electrification. So we've seen that in the cars, we're actually seeing that a bit in shipping as well, and we believe you'll see it in aviation. Again, we saw that yesterday. People are trying to do that, and the reason why electric motors are cheaper, they're more efficient, fewer moving parts, and they're essentially they get you to zero emissions at the point of use, not necessarily over the entire life cycle. So that's coming as well. And we think that the third trend, which is autonomy, is going to be the capper. So all of those 3 things together, bringing autonomy to the aviation space, mean that this is an interesting space. And if you're an airline, and if you make money from flying people from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, which actually is not a JetBlue route, but a lot of people do that, there will now be an alternative, which is you go in your autonomous vehicle with 3 of your friends, and you play cards as you go to Las Vegas. And it might take you half an hour longer than flying, but no hassle of going through security at the airport, and you've got your car with you when you get there, and you're not the one that's driving. So in that world, and especially in the US, where up until now, really, if you want to travel any long distance, you almost have to fly. I don't know if any of you have been in a Greyhound bus ever, but if you've done it once, you probably don't want to do it again. So you're going to fly, and now there's an alternative in these sort of sub 1,000 kilometer routes where you could say, well, I'll go in an autonomous vehicle. You might believe in Hyperloop or high-speed rail. Those might be alternatives as well, yet to be proven, but we see the world is changing. So that's what drove the investments in Zunum and Joby. Zunum is a fixed-wing, short takeoff, 12-seater initially, the ZA10. And the idea there is it's an electric hybrid, so they're hedging their bets. But the idea is to bring down the operating costs for a passenger mile to below that of a Q400, which is pretty much the winner currently. And if you can do that, you can change the infrastructure. So, Elon Musk is a very successful person, much more successful than me, and probably much smarter than me. I've never met him, but the concept of building tunnels underneath the freeways in California, which is well known for its seismic activity, or even building tunnels over the ground, again in California with all of our earthquakes, just seems a bit odd. Why not take advantage of the fact that there are more than 300 airports in California? There's more than 5,000 airports in the US. Only less than 150 of them are used for commercial service. Got all this real estate that exists, and to Christian's point earlier from Volocopter, start off with the routes that are airport to airport. Start off with the existing infrastructure. You don't have to build air, it's already there. And by the way, the Z-axis gives you a whole lot more space to play with. There are no babies in strollers going across the road. There's no kids running after a ball. There's no person who's very aged and shouldn't be driving. There's no road works. There's no trees, right? You just got the air, essentially. I noticed that whenever you see one of these wonderful videos, there's never any wind or rain or snow or sleet. So there are some issues, but that's our thesis. And Joby, we believe, is one of the ones that's probably relatively far ahead in terms of their development, in terms of the sound that the thing produces, the range. It's a 4-seater plus a pilot, eventually autonomous, and very close to the regulator, which is going to be a key skill.
Sounds good. So before moving to the questions, I think it's going to go fast. I had a question regarding the different use cases, and actually all this panel is about picking winners. That's the title that we have for this panel. The next one will be also about investment, but more once the investments are made, what do the investor do once they are in the board? Right now we are before investment. How do you judge the various teams, various concepts? We've seen over this day and an hour just before different approaches coming from urban mobility to regional aircraft. How do you make your choices, basically? And maybe I'll ask you first, and then.
I would say two major things: physics and the team. Physics includes chemistry for me, and so a lot of people have made a lot of interesting predictions about what their vehicles might do, and the reality is that most of it actually isn't supported by physics. So, like in VC, you can claim anything, but if you're telling me you're going to change the laws of physics, then I'm not going to believe you. So first of all, it's that. So the thing that they're proposing, could it actually even exist? Could it actually do the thing that they're saying they're doing? Even in the wildest case. And a lot of the time, the answer is no. It's the same thing as like, I'm going to use a blockchain for that. Right? And the answer is why? And so similar. So that's the first thing. And then the second is the team, because the panel is about picking winners, but honestly speaking, I've no idea who's going to be a winner. And venture capital is about spending a lot of money on various different bets and hoping a couple of them succeed, right? It's a hit or miss business. So we are almost by definition going to be spending money that will be wasted, but what we hope is that we spend some of it that will return all the money that we wasted and more. That's the idea. So I don't know who's going to be the winner, but I will try and pick the team that looks like they have the right skills and are flexible enough that as things change, they'll be able to adapt. And a good example would be the business model. So, what is the business model going to be? I work for an airline. I can tell you right now, being an airline, Dean knows this very well, that's not an easy life. It's not like the money is rolling in every second and you're making huge profits. Okay, so are you going to be an operator? Great. How much money are you going to make? What's the competition going to be like? You're going to be a manufacturer? Only slightly better than being an airline, frankly speaking. So where are you going to be on the value chain? So you're going to have to be very flexible if you're going to make this thing work.
I got a bit of a follow-up question for that. Looking at some of the decks that I've seen about urban air mobility, one of the challenges I've had is understanding how to understand the progress that the companies have made. You see one, they've made a 16th prototype and then a quarter prototype, and then they're saying, right, well, that puts us at this stage, and we've done some research over here and a sort of drone scale pilot. How do you sort of understand what stage, and for your investments in Joby and Zumo, how do you understand at the early stage how far along they are and how much credibility to give the progress that they've achieved today?
It's very difficult. I mean, so for the prototypes, it's squared cube laws. So you build something and you scale it up, doesn't mean it's going to work, right? So that's an important aspect of it. The reality is most of it's maths at the start, and in our industry, it's all about trades. Okay, so you're going to do this, and that's going to give you this, but it's also going to make that worse. So how do you make all the trades close so that this thing can actually fly? And so the first thing you want to see is, do they have the team in place that can actually do that? And then what progress are they making in terms of their maths to say that this looks like it will close and will be a viable design? Then you build a prototype, then you need the full-scale prototype, then you want manned flights, right? You want them to be engaging with the regulators relatively early, and you want them to be cognizant of what that means, right? So, it's type and production certification that needs to happen, and you kind of need to massage the regulator and go along with them, and you need to understand from a regulatory point of view. It's like being a limited partner in a venture capital fund, right? So, nobody ever got a big star for choosing somebody that's a high risk that fails, right? So for a regulator, all the risks are on me to say, I don't want to take any risks about saying that this thing works. So I want to know that it works, because the downside for me as a regulator is pretty bad, and for the people who would be on that vehicle would be pretty bad. So you need to see that progression. But as I said earlier, I think it's a huge risk.
Just a couple of comments on that. I think there is a large body of aerospace experience out there. And so, I think it would be a little bit arrogant to go out there and not tap into that body of experience to sort of evaluate the question that you're going into. So when we looked at actually one of your deals, which we haven't invested in yet, but I think is quite interesting, Zunum, we hired an outside aerospace consultant who had done fixed-wing aircraft design before, and that was extremely helpful. He validated that they have a good design, that it can fly, that it'll actually largely hit the cost parameters, and he also highlighted the risk factors associated with that. Now, the more esoteric the aircraft design, the harder that gets, right? Because there's less experience. And so, what we're mostly interested in is figuring out things, just to build on what you were saying, the team's extremely important. The market has to be very big. And for us, that means if you're investing in an aerospace concept, you have to have a significantly lower cost position than what came before and what you're replacing. Otherwise, you're not going to have a market. And I think the aerospace consultants and other people who've built these vehicles before can help you validate that. The other people that are actually very helpful in that area, at least from my perspective, are the NASA guys, because they've built just about every kind of concept that's out there already. And they've learned all the hard lessons on it, and so they're a very interesting group to reference when you look at these concepts.
I completely agree with everything that was just said, and I think one last point is actually around the applicability as well. So speaking for our business specifically for EasyJet, although unmanned and autonomous vehicles really don't fit in with today's model, because EasyJet flies, narrow bodies and doesn't do cargo at all. It's about thinking further ahead of the applicability. So we invested in a company called Dronamics, who are here today and actually spoke yesterday, I think. They are an unmanned cargo. They're designing an unmanned cargo airplane. It's the size of a Cessna. It's designed to fly autonomously. So you would ask yourself, what is the applicability for EasyJet? And actually, it's around thinking, what could we do? And to Raj's good point earlier about there's so many airstrips and airfields that are not used commercially. How could you actually use that for logistics? For example, a good example that EasyJet pointed out was carrying spare parts around the network. Today, spare parts, when an aircraft goes tech, are carried on a normal, a line aircraft, so you have to wait for that flight to actually depart, or on a smaller aircraft that still has loads of suffers from the same restrictions of flying into Gatwick or another congested airspace. So it's around, how do you go around that? How do you allow to expedite operational processes? And there's different ways to think about it, actually.
Good. So I think we could speak for hours. We have about 15 minutes. I think it's time also to use your collective knowledge and your curiosity actually now to maybe have some questions from the audience. I don't think I'm putting you on the spot, maybe.
That's fine. Can we put Slido up?
Yeah.
Here you go.
Sure.
So in defense of EasyJet, they're really smart not to have any leg room because people won't pay for it. And so, it's just something to keep in mind. When you look at who's on this panel, there's actually derivatives of 3 low-cost carriers up here, but you actually don't see Singapore Airlines on this panel. And there's a reason for that, because almost all of the great aviation successes over the last 30 years have been from offering a good quality product, but that's cheaper.
Thank you for answering to that. I'm 5'2", so I've never had issues with that.
I'll pick up the flying cars parked in your street. Probably none. And I think probably fully autonomous vehicles, none too. Because the way that the business model's been structured is you own a car, and then Uber sort of did step 1, which was transitioning from a cost of ownership model to a per trip fee. That will persist with autonomous vehicles, and then I think that model will persist with urban air mobility. So I think it's very unlikely, and I've seen a few of the sort of the companies that are developing car to plane, back to car, concepts. And I think it's probably a lot more likely that the innovation will come, from the sort of the ride-hailing of the sky type model. And I don't think we'll see any parked in the street.
And I think if your car is parked in the street, then you're not getting enough utilization out of it, so it shouldn't be there in the first place. How much capacity will urban air mobility add to the solution compared to mass transit systems? A lot, actually, and frankly, a lot more than trains. So don't know what you're comparing this to, but if you compare it to a train that goes from A to B and how many people that carries per hour, it's not that great, especially if you factor in how much it costs you to deliver that train. On Joby, for example, which is an air taxi that had 4 people, you'd have to have a lot of them for this to work, and you'd have to fly a lot of missions every hour. And there are lots of questions that aren't answered. So the Volocopter guy was talking about, the batteries and getting them charged and all that. My question is, where does that energy come from? Because certainly where I live in the US, well, first of all, our energy utility just declared bankruptcy. But secondly, even if they hadn't, and let's say that SFO wanted to add a few megawatts of energy, that would cost them probably 5 to 10 years and $100 million. Okay, so where is the power going to come from to charge all these wonderful batteries that will be in all these things? And it brings up another point that we were getting to. So I said about physics and the team, and Sam added about where are they, and Dean talked about the market, and Alice talked about accessibility. But there's also manufacturing. So on a good day, on a good year, Airbus and Boeing will manufacture a couple of thousand planes, maybe. And that's not going to cut it in UAM. Not at all. So, we need to go to people like the car manufacturers who can make tens of thousands of these or hundreds of thousands of these. And that's really the scale at which this will work. And so if you think about the number of missions you can fly per hour, and Uber's done a lot of this in their Uber Elevate stuff, you can actually add a huge amount of capacity. So it is possible for it to make a difference.
It was funny, I worked in the F-16 plant for a while, and it took over 50,000 man-hours to build an F-16. And then a couple years later, I worked in the Ford Taurus plant, and it took 14 and a half assembly hours to build a Ford Taurus. So it just gives you a sense, obviously military aircraft on the other end of the scale, but it gives you a sense of what the gap is between aerospace production and car production.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues nicely into a point I wanted to make, which is, premium OEM, automotive OEMs are, obviously incredibly scared about the developments that are coming, and they're trying to prepare themselves for this transition to autonomous vehicles. Go one step further, transition from autonomous ground transport to autonomous air transport. What is their role to play in that? Are they still selling people a physical vehicle, or are they transitioning into being a service-based business model? Do automotive OEMs move towards the kind of the airline model, where does it actually matter what the vehicle is, and they're actually providing a service now? So a premium Jaguar Land Rover service is actually more about the experience when you get in a car an urban air vehicle. And understanding how do you transition from selling a product to selling a service. And I think that transition is one that companies like premium car companies, but also the sort of mass market car companies are trying to navigate now, and they're sort of realizing the extent to which this could affect their business models in the next 20 years.
I'm probably with the most short-term outlook compared to these guys, but I think it's all driven by the sharing economy. And an example that I can do from our portfolio is nowhere near autonomous vehicles or drones, but it's around, we have a concept, a company actually that we've invested in called Car on Away. They're basically the Airbnb for cars. They're based at Gatwick, and they're looking to expand into other airports, by the way. And essentially, they allow you to rent out your car while you're at the airport. So if you guys have ever, flown from an airport and left your car in the car park, you know how expensive it is. And also going on holiday is generally quite expensive. So if you can make some more money out of your car, it's a great idea. And I know you might be thinking right now, but actually, if you can make an extra grand while you're on holiday and have it serviced and valeted and in your short stay car park when you land, it's great. And actually, airports have received it really well because it frees up capacity and it creates more capacity that they can resell. So yes, a lot less longer term outlook though.
There's a question about drones in airports. Yes, huge issue. Dallas-Fort Worth right now is working with Uber to try and build approach vectors to get into the airport to put down your manned drone, and it's a bit of a nightmare to be able to work it out in a way that will actually be both safe and efficient. So obviously from the UAM perspective, the further away you park from the airport, the less convenient it is. And so they want to be able to sort of come into the airport practically to the terminal. But clearly from safety perspective, it's probably going to be hard, especially since ATC is, it's awful. I mean, it's awful the world over, to be honest. And so we don't actually have in place the system to be able to manage all these different sorts of vehicles in airspace at the same time. And that is a critical component that needs to come, and again, will be a factor. And that's why I say it's hard to pick winners in this space, because usually in VC, you pick something where a maximum of one miracle needs to happen for this thing to be successful. But in this space, you need 4 or 5 miracles for it to be successful, so it's going to be difficult, which is my advice to companies seeking funding.
Yeah, the airspace issues are huge. And so, back to the urban mobility thing, the biggest issue, I think, is just how are you going to manage the airspace? Because I think the vehicles are all buildable. People are building them. There's lots of concepts out there that could be built. Can you fly them at enough scale to pay for a $100 million development program? That's a real question. I mean, when you think about there's about 45,000 flights a day in the US, and there's 15,000 air traffic controllers. I saw NASA get up and say they wanted to have 300,000 flights a day for urban air mobility in LA by 2030. So that requires probably multiple miracles to make that happen, right? It doesn't mean it won't, but I think the biggest investment risk from my perspective in this industry is being too early. And this is something Raj and we've talked about before, but all of these things are going to happen. The question is, can you build a sequence of events that will logically allow you to make money in a reasonable time frame? And I think one of the reasons that you see strategic investors being so important in the space and institutional investors, particularly on the aerospace side, being less prominent is when you're looking at 4 years or 3 years to get to certification and $100 million of funding before you can see revenue. It's a very tough proposition unless you're already in the space, right? And so I think this is one of the major issues that the industry is going to have to handle, because the institutional investors are critical. And you want to have institutional investors if you're a founder. And so you need to find a way to make money faster than relying on something that's going to require a complete overhaul of the air traffic control system to make it happen.
Do you think that will be a really big barrier to autonomous urban air mobility, in a way that with cars, you don't have this overarching sort of governance, people telling you where to go, when you can go? Will ATC sort of put restrict the innovation possible in urban air mobility, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's going to restrict the innovation possible. I think it's going to restrict the timing. So, for example, right now, to the drone point, we can't even identify all the drones in the air. I mean, ADS-B for Part 135 aviation in the US and Part 91 aviation is only going into place this year, but most drones can't be remotely identified. And even if they could be remotely identified, the air traffic control infrastructure to actually make sense of all those identifications isn't in place. So there are enormous challenges to make this happen. Will it happen? I'm 100% sure it'll happen. Like, will it happen in the next 5 years? That's a lot more dicey.
So yeah, I think it's addressing some of questions popping up in the screen, like advice for companies seeking funding, and I feel like early stage really. I really agree with you with the institutional funding as well, to be able to de-risk a lot of things so that other people can come. There was also another one, maybe another stream of thought. Let's say we spoke about the drone, maybe being an inspiration to flying cars, autonomous vehicle. What about existing aircraft? Could we use that to actually use the current aircraft design and gradually move toward electric, hybrid, and designs? Is that a path that you think would be good, or people should just go ahead and try to figure out all the miracles they need to do?
I'm not enough of an aircraft designer at all to be able to say this, but what people have told me is that they're not retrofitting because the power delivery profile of the different sorts of propulsion systems requires a different sort of airframe to optimize. And so I haven't seen people trying to do that. What I have seen people trying to do is to retrofit autonomy into existing aircraft. And the reason for that is that you can get the two systems separately certified. So you can get the aircraft is already certified, and then you can get the autonomy system certified, and the combination will be able to fly. And that strikes me as a very good approach. I've seen a lot of companies out there who are all delivering an autonomous electric vehicle tomorrow. And the problem is that even if you could do that, which I doubt, the regulator wouldn't necessarily go for it. So, if you said, well, I'm going to deliver a caravan, and it's got a retrofit of autonomous systems, and I'm going to use it for cargo, and I'm going to use it in a remote area or over the water, that's a much better proposition for a regulator to say, yes, okay, let's try that. And if that works, then maybe we'll do it over slightly more urban areas, still with cargo. And then eventually we'll have people in it, and so on and so forth. And so you take these relatively small steps to be able to get to the future. And, Sam, you were talking about like on the ground and how things aren't regulated. That's going to happen as well. We're going to have ATC for ground. If you really want, if you're in a Tesla in a traffic jam, you're still in a traffic jam. So the fact is that just having autonomy doesn't in of itself allow you to get better mobility and better throughput. You have to have everything coordinated in order for that to happen. And so unfortunately that's going to happen. And I think the future of driving is going to be for fun on the weekends as opposed to getting from A to B. Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, there are some companies out there that are doing retrofits like MagniX, which is funded by the same guy who just did the big funding for Eviation. But I've heard the same as you, Raj, that you're going to lose 50% of the benefit by having an airframe that isn't designed for electric propulsion. So, getting 50%, put that on a Caravan, is that valuable? As long as it's cheap enough, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. On autonomy, I think autonomy is very interesting for aviation. I mean, automobiles, it's sort of a 0-1 proposition where, you've already got the cheapest possible labor in the car. I mean, at some level, if you're driving it yourself, it's free, conceptually. And so there's really no value unless you make the car totally autonomous. And as a matter of fact, there might be negative value because you might cause car crashes due to inattention. In aviation, that's very, very different, where partial autonomy, eliminating the co-pilot, would be enormously valuable to the industry because of the labor shortage. And, putting pilots online, even if you still have two pilots, is much more efficient than having a crew rotation where you have to move people all over the country, put them up in hotels, have all kinds of limitations on how long you can fly. So there's a ton of value in autonomy for aviation, and it's not the kind of value that will be generated in autos. It'll be generated much more incrementally. So I think we'll see a ton of innovation there over the next few years.
Okay, good. You have
I just want to tell I always tell the same joke. Dave Whelan, who was the CTO of Boeing, told me that the flight deck of the future will have a person and a dog. And the job of the person will be to feed the dog, and the job of the dog will be to bite the person if they try and touch the controls. Welcome to the future.
That's a good one. I could almost see the final jokes of of the panel. Just one question, because when I look at your areas of focus about travel, mostly they're mostly like softwares, really around passengers, trying to get to bring them value, to take into account their mindset. What about public acceptance of this urban mobility? Because obviously we're all passionate about this, we want to push this, we see this, but is it really widely agreed in the public, and how does it affect your investments? Because for the other companies, you have this in mind. So what about these ones?
Yeah, from my perspective, pretty much none of the companies we've spoken to have done any surveying of any customers to see, forget whether it's accepted, as to whether they'd be ready to pay for it. Nothing, zero. I mean, they all are, that sort of entrepreneur mindset, which is, this is a really cool idea, I'm going to build it. So there's very little out there. NASA's doing some stuff now. Georgia Tech is doing some stuff now where they're trying to do that. But yes, I think public acceptance is going to be a huge issue. If you're familiar with Surf Air, they actually fly out of the small airport right next to my office, and they got stopped by a town called Atherton, which is on their flight path. Now they're flying Pilatus 12Cs. They're pretty quiet actually, and yet the town shut these guys down not because of the noise, but because they just didn't like airplanes flying over their properties. And they're very wealthy and they've got lots of lawyers. And so this is going to be a huge issue. And I'm not sure that's going to be easily solved.
I'd just say the way forward on that to getting acceptance is to do things that are already being done, but in an incremental way. So if you said, what's going to be tougher in terms of public acceptance, flying helicopters into people's front yards or drones into people's front yards, or flying a 12-seat plane between two airports that already exist, I think the answer is pretty clear. And so, incrementalism, I think, is important, because once people get used to smaller aircraft, shorter trips, then they may consider other destinations in terms of takeoff and landing.
Yeah, I think actually, just drawing again a parallel to sort of the autonomous vehicle industry, again, this incremental approach of having a safety driver in the car. So at least when you're crossing the road and you look at the guy in the driver's seat, at least you know that he's about to stop, or you at least think that they're about to stop as you cross the road. I guess when you look at urban air mobility, having a pilot sitting next to the passenger, as you move towards autonomy, does that matter as much? Because people aren't maybe seeing the person sitting in the car. It's maybe the idea of being autonomous is not the issue. It's actually is it just the idea of a smaller aircraft that they're just not used to, and it's sort of maybe invasive in the way that we've seen drones being invasive?
There's a lot of different changes, right? Yeah. Big aircraft to small aircraft. People are used to 737s and A320s, and even a Q400 is a 80-seat aircraft. I mean, it's a big aircraft. 12-seat aircraft is bumpier. It flies at a different altitude. It's just going to feel very different. When you go to one pilot versus two pilots, that's a huge change for people psychologically. I know I would really want to know what the backup system is if there's only one pilot. So, I mean, I think it's everything. Flying into small airports, flying into a place that may not initially have security regulations that are as strict as a major airport. I mean, you can just list off these things, and there's dozens of them. And I think you just need to chip away little bit by little bit, and if you get people comfortable with part, it's going to be easier to get people comfortable with some of the more radical things.
All right. I think we will just stop here the panel. There's another one about investment just right now. So actually this topic is living another life now with Brian, I think, coming on stage after me. Thank you very much for these panel discussions. I think It's just the start of other side discussions with the audience. Thank you as well for the questions raised. So
thanks.